So, good morning, friends. Once again, I welcome you back to this class of video lecture. And, friends, today we take up a very famous poem of BA Part 3rd English Literature Paper 1. And the name of the poem is The Sea and the Skylark. And this poem has been written by a very eminent poet, G.M. Hopkins. This is BA Part 3rd English Literature, friends. The Sea and Skylark is a sonnet, a poem of 14 lines. It was originally titled Walking by the Sea. In this sonnet, the sea and the skylark are described in the octave, the first 8 lines. These are contrasted with men in the sestet. The mood of the poet is joyous in the octave, where he describes the natural sounds of the sea and the skylark singing. But with the very first line of the sestet, the mood changes to one of gloom and despondency. The remaining lines of the sestet are deeply pessimistic. The poet foresees the total decline and even dissolution of the human race. The poem ends with a deep sense of loss at the thought uh, that man is losing his identity and destroying his pattern. The theme of this sonnet is a contrast between the life-giving purity of nature and the sordidness of the civilization that man is creating. The town mentioned in the poem is Ryle in Wales, but the poem is not an attack particularly on that town or the Wales people. It is a general meditation on nature and man occasioned by a particular scene. Catherine Magazine points out that Hopkins explained to Robert Bridges what rash fresh. He wrote in a letter to Robert Bridges that rash fresh meant a headlong and exciting new snatch of singing, resumption by the lark of his song. So there are some lines in the poem which are not very clear, which are obscure, unidentified, which whose meaning cannot be drawn. There is some obscurity of meaning, however, the development of idea of the poem can be easily understood. And so we firstly come to the first part of the poem. On ear and ear too, noises too cold to end, trench right the tide that ramps against the shore with a flood or a fall, low lull of or all roar, frequenting there while moon shall veer and wend. Left hand of land, I hear the lark ascend. These lines have been taken from the opening lines of the poem. While walking near the sea, the poet hears two sounds which make a deep impression on him, largely to stress the contrast with the frail, crumbling town. He calls them too old to end. On his right is the sea, which at high tide bounds wildly against the shore. At high tide, the sea continually roars, while at ebb, when it is over a quarter of a mile away, there is a low, lulling sound in the distance. As long as the moon's phases change and it orbits the earth, the sea will be found repeatedly visiting the shore. The moon's orbit of the earth is the main cause of the tides. On the poet's left, above the land, he hears the lark which sings as it ascends until it is just visible as a speck against the sky. Hopkins was intrigued by the bird's ability to ascend in full song time after time during the day. It also sings while descending. The skylark song, ever the same, seems to follow a musical score which may be compared to a skein of wool that is successively unwound as he sings in the sky and rewound when he returns to earth, so that each song is as fresh as the one before. The score of the skylark seems to whirl off the wind of his throat in a wild ecstasy, not in a smooth or even flow, but as it were in crisp curls of melody, whose every note may be compared to a lock of fleece weaving in the air. So, the scope of the skylark seems to whirl off the whinge of his throat in a wild ecstasy, and not in a smooth or even flow, but as it were in crisp curls of melody, whose every note may be compared to a lock of fleece waving in the air. The skylark pours out music without effort, and yet he pelts his fresh song with continuous effort till he has spilt and spent all, and there is nothing left. He refreshes and sings again. This goes on forever. So, the first opening lines have this meaning, friends. Now, the last lines called the sestet part of the sonnet. The poet says that the two natural sounds of the sea and the skylark are putting to shame this town of Ryle, where life is shallow and devoid of vitality. The sounds of nature, because of their purity, rise far above the sordid and confused human sounds of the town. The poet says that we human beings are supposed to be the pride of creation. Again, I repeat, this is the gist of the poem. The poet says that we human beings are supposed to be the pride of creation and the honored lords of the whole world. However, our condition has now worse. We have now lost the joy and charm of the earth when all things were in their prime. Now the static and dynamic aspects of our being are in process of decay and disintegration. This process will lead us to the state of dust which awaits us in death and which recalls man's original state of slime. Our end will thus rejoin our beginning. We shall end as we begin. We are witnessing not progress but retrogression. Hopkins have looks at the developing industrial society which has its own ills. Hopkins, he doesn't enter into the life of industrial society and finds it wanting. He merely stands at a distance and condemns. So finally, this poem is about the weaknesses of the industrial civilization. The Sea and Skylark is one of the lesser known poems of Hopkins. Felix Rendell and the Windhover are extremely well known. The Sea and the Skylark, however, does reflect several of the qualities of Hopkins's poetry. This poem is a sonnet having two parts, sestet and octave. The polarity of the title is between water and air, the sea and the skylark representing nature. They represent purity. More specifically, the main body of the sonnet is in the last six lines. These lines introduce a third point, earth inhabited by man. The shallow and frail town represents pollution and decay. Hopkins wants to point out that shallowness and frailty and the sordid turbidness of the time. The sea and the skylark are not important as part of the main theme. They are merely representative of the purity of nature. The poet's concern in that sonnet is to show the decay of the time represented by the city, industrialization, capitalism. We are life's pride and earned for crown have lost that cheer and crown chain crown chain of crown chain of crown chain of crown chain of Earth's past prime are breaking down to man's last dust, drain fast towards man's first slime. The poem tells us not so much about the 19th century as about himself, that the underlying optimism about human nature, which was present in the wreck of the doucheland, has faded and has been replaced by a sense of foreboding, whereas previously Hopkins looked forward to a holy Christian world. He now looks nostalgically back to the past. Hopkins's sensitivity to beauty seems to be delicate, that he appears unable to consider industrialization except with overwhelming horror. He never enters into the life of industrial society and finds it wanting. He merely stands at a distance and condemns. So, in the poem, we have man use of alliteration, we have the use of rhythm, we have the use of contrast between nature and the world, between nature and the man, and finally, the poem is rich as far as biblical allusions are significant are concerned. So it's a very good poem, The Sea and Skylark, and this is an example of pure sprung rhythm. Sprung rhythm is a flexible stress rhythm using feet varying from one isolated stress syllable to panoic feet. So you just make a statement regarding sprung rhythm. Thank you, friends. Thank you so much.